Hey, it's Unique History Channel. Tonight we're going to be doing a selected reading from Modern Spain, 1875-1980 by Raymond Carr, and we'll be doing Chapter 9, The Civil War, 1936 to 1939. If the conspirators had planned a painless military takeover by sympathetic garrisons in the provincial capitals, followed by a triumphant march on Madrid, they failed. If the government, blinded by optimistic reports, regarded what the rising what the Prime Minister called an absurd conspiracy, they were deluded. Where the security forces and the overwhelming majority of the population supported the government, or where the military were divided or hesitant, the rising failed. This was true of Madrid, Barcelona, and Valencia. Where junior officers were resolute in leading enterprises, cities with large working-class populations, Seville, and Valladolid. For instance, to tell the rebels, in spite of the role of the local security forces, the victory for the Popular Front was everywhere represented as a proletarian epic. The siege by the crowd of the Montaña barracks in Madrid, the barricades manned by the CNT in Barcelona. The half-truth gave the unions a moral claim to power as the saviors of the Republic, betrayed by a feeble government of bourgeois republicans, which had refused to arm the workers and sought to come to terms with factious generals. The patchy success of the rebellion and the subsequent fortunes of war divided Spain into two zones that did not always correspond to social structure or previous political allegiance. The Civil War is incomprehensible without the concept of geographical loyalty. Those caught in a hostile zone either had to conform, escape, or risk imprisonment or shooting. Loyalty was never a matter of locality. For the nationalists, whose cause is more easily defined in negatives, what they were against, the war was a class war against Marxists, a religious war against the Masons and freethinkers, and a war against separatists. The lines of class allegiance were crossed by religious and conviction or regional loyalties. Thus, the Catholic Basques fought for an atheist republic, which had granted them the self-government the nationalists continued to destroy. Respectable Catalan bourgeoisie, horrified by the assassinations and the uncontrollables of the CNT, for the same reason supported a government dominated by working-class parties. Nevertheless, they were free to choose. The working class chose the republic, and the upper class is, with few exceptions, fanatic nationalists. It was the loyalty of the middle class that was in doubt. Many followed in the footsteps of the older generation of intellectuals, disenchanted with the proletarian style of the latter days of the Republic. Communist propagandists set out to capture the loyalty of the little man by presenting the war as a defense of his interests in a bourgeois democracy. The Civil War separated and split families. There was a generational divide. Phalanges students hid their pistols from their parents in hollowed-out books. The street dust-ups of the socialist youth alarmed the older party members, and the Carlist youth found the abrasive oratory of the Falconde more to their taste than the speeches of the accommodating aristocrat Rosendo. The military rising itself was an affair of captains and majors. Only 3 generals in command of the divisions declared on July 18th. In the military as in the civil sphere, wrote the Catalan Phalanges José María Fontana, the bulk of the movement was cosa de gente joven, or a young people's affair. If these young enthusiasms imagined they were making a world safe for the under 40s, they were to be sadly disillusioned. 2 factors needed emphasis. Firstly, the army was an institution that did not revolt. It was divided, and without loyalty of senior officers, the Republic could have never had organized an army. If all officers had joined the rising, it might have been over in a matter of days. In Madrid, divisions of garrisons doomed the conspirators to be thrown like the rag dolls from the windows of the Montaña barracks. The fact that the Nationalist Army and the columns of civilian volunteers in metropolitan Spain were, in the early days, relatively weak fighting force made the African army under General Franco the decisive element. Without these disciplined units, the rising might have turned out to be a disastrous gamble. Once Franco had ferried his troops his troops from Morocco to the mainland, mainland's military, and ultimately his political preeminence were assured. The second decisive factor was the distribution of resources between the two zones. On any calculation, the material resources of the government, from maps to gold reserves, outweighed those of the rebels. In the early day, the Republic held the industrial resources of Spain and the nationalists of the more rural heartland of Castile together with Andalusia and Galicia. This balance seemed to favor the Republic, but industry demanded imported raw materials and great cities needed food. Republican exports never covered raw material imports, especially after the loss of mines of the North, and the industry was starved. So the civilian population struggling by 1938 on a diet of Dr. Negrin's resistance pills, lentils, at the mercy of a new race of black marketeers listening to the street. This is the first war in which the radio was an important weapon to the nationalist propaganda, which promises the white bread of Franco. The Madrid's government first reaction to the military rising that spread from Morocco to the mainland on July 18th was to resign. The response of the proletarian parties was to defend arms for the workers. A government that refuses to arm its workers is a fascist government, thundered Lagrero Caballero. This new government of Martinez Barrio, formed on July 19th, refused to do. By seeking at the last moment to negotiate with Mola, it has been accused of failing to rise in its historic task of fear of a workers' takeover. When Gurel's government, against a cabinet of left Republicans, did arm the workers' militias, such a takeover occurred. In every town and village that remained loyal to the Republic, the normal machinery of government was replaced by local committees of party militants whose orders were enforced by armed patrols of the militiamen. This was the era of confiscated cars, huge posters, and lorry loads of enthusiasts with clenched fists. The whole state apparatus was destroyed, wrote Dolores Ibadie, the communist writer famous La Pagineria, and the power lay in the streets. It was picked up by the great proletarian organizations, the UGT, the PSOE, and the CNT. The officers' counter-revolution had unleashed the most profound European working-class revolution since 1917. The immediate manifestation, the Bohemian age of this revolution, was an outburst of terror and indiscriminate killings which the government could not control. 6,832 priests were slaughtered and churches were burnt. The mindless version of September massacres of the French Revolution was of great importance. It confirmed the hostility of the upper middle class and provided nationalist propagandists with atrocity stories. The pornography of war, they were the emotional cement of the quote-unquote cause. Barcelona became a city where it was injustice to wear a tie. Madrid, the rich cowered into embassies, waiting for the opportunity to slip over to the national zone, where waiters and hotel porters existed. Now we are gentlemen again, wrote one of Franco's future ministers arriving in San Sebastian. The systematic execution of the working class leaders in the national zone put a river of blood between the working class and the gentlemen. The constructive side of the Summer Revolution was contained in the concept of collectivization, the takeover of factories and estates by committees of workers or the unions. Collectivization was the most intense where the CNT was dominant. Its epicenter was in Catalonia. It must be emphasized that it left whole areas untouched. Madrid, for example, was more normal than Barcelona. Collectivization sometimes instituted religiosity polienteri, the men of ideas. In the industry, egoism of centuries ended, according to the CNT press. In agrarian collectives, the brutal force of landowners was replaced by social love. In self-governing committees where the local cafe was closed, money replaced by work chits and prostitution, alcohol, and visits to the cinema frowned on. The collectives have been defended as an inspiring social experiment and criticized as an absurd and war economy that cried out for the rational distribution of scarce resources. Certainly the collectives tended to fragment the economy by a process known as syndical selfishness, in which each union collective scrambled for raw materials and the preferred higher wages to a higher output as in the capitalist system. The CNT leadership and the Generalidad were fully aware of these shortcomings, but attempts to coordinate the production via economic council did not produce the CNT utopia of planned economy without state intervention. Utopia could not be realized with wartime shortages and the CNT collective starved of credit and raw materials by their political enemies. These enemies pointed to the decline in industrial production, to the resentments created by forced colonizations of artisans, butchers, bakers, and peasant proprietors. We succeeded in rousing the villages from their slumber, and all the villages in which we control with an iron will now follow the norm of the CNT. This iron was exercised at the expense of small-scale orange producers of the Levante after 1937, the only export earners of the Republic. The safeguard of the social revolution was the militia, which was formed by Workers' Party on an ad hoc basis, often around the personality of a leader who could bully officers into giving him weapons or commandeered lorries. Units varied in size from a few dozen to the Communist Party's 5th Regiment. In the militia columns, military discipline was replaced by revolutionary discipline. Elected officers could only enforce status after a wary process of consultation, for CNT militiamen to assault an officer as a symbol of slavery. To deploy such units, after they were to return home without orders, with any regard to logistics, was a nightmare for the regular officers of the general staff. Victory in the war was a result of the organization of enthusiasm. In André Malraux's words, the task of Republican government was to organize the apocalypse. To prevent the collapse of loyalty in large sectors of the population, excesses of the spontaneous revolution had to be curbed. To conduct a regular war, the control of the central government over impoverished communities had to be restored. This dilemma divided the politicians of the Republic. There were those to whom sacrifice to the conquest of the revolution had meant the betrayal of the working class, which saved the Republic in the July days, and those who believed the war against fascism could only be won by a strong centralized government, which could amount an efficient war effort, and that meaning dismantling the revolutionary conquest and reversal of the revolution or intended to retain a popular front embracing bourgeois parties. The primacy of revolution was defended by the CNT and POUM. The latter, a Revolutionary Workers' Party of Trotsky ideas, but not affiliated with the Forced Trotskyist International, was led by two able Marxist intellectuals, Joaquin Marin and Andres Nin. In the eyes of the POUM, sympathetic to the CNT and as a small party dependent on the CNT masses for effective action, the great fault of the anarcho-syndicalism was the large syndicalists' dogmatic refusal to seize political power as a step they could have taken on 18 in July, which for an opportunity would never occur. The proponents of social normalcy and orthodox war effort, controlled by the central government of the Republican Party and the right wing of the Socialist Party, which followed Prieto and the Communists. The Spanish Communist transformation to social conservatives was partly in response of the policies from Stalin, searching for support from popular fronts in respectable democracies. The war, therefore, was represented in communist propaganda as a war to defend a bourgeois democracy with a profound social content. But the communist defense of word government was based on its lacking of working-class support in Spain. Objective historical conditions do not permit a proletarian revolution. Recruits must come from the middle class, scared by the upheavals of July, and seeking some stronger protector than the left Republicans who, as Largo Cabero told Stalin, were doing very little to assert their own political personality. This protection the professional classes found in the disciplined party with impeccable proletarian credentials and immensely inefficient propaganda machine, a party that could halt the spontaneous revolution without being accused of betraying the working class. The rapid growth of the party's strength and influence is explained by its control of the all-important Soviet arms supply and leverage denied to Republicans and Socialists who looked in vain for help in their allies in the West. But the Communists would have remained powerless without the support of the left Republicans and Pietro Socialists. These allies were not communist dupes, they were conventional politicians appalled by revolutionary chaos and militarism of government. As Zana's diaries reflect his horror at the excesses of July and the military failures of the militia system, he saw in the Communist Party the necessary ally. However, the strength of unions and the mystique of a proletarian revolution were governmental concentration and a purposeful articulation of the anti-fascist forces to be achieved. Clearly, the task was beyond Garrel's pure Republican ministry, which Largo Caballero dismissed as a reactionary farce. The government, as Anna put it, must either adopt the revolution or repress it. Since it lacked the means or the resolution to risk a civil war within a civil war, there was no alternative but to adapt the revolution for hope of controlling it. This task entrusted to Largo Caballero, who became prime minister on September 4th, 1936, obstinate and secretive, avoiding awkward interviews, to retiring to bed at 9 o'clock, he was to Pietro an imbecile. But he alone possessed the prestige, if not the will, to bring the workers' organization into a cooperative mode. On November 4th, with Franco's armies outside Madrid, the CNT joined his government, and for the first time in European history, communist and anarchist ministers sat with bourgeois colleagues in the same cabinet. The decision of the CNT leaders to join the government was the most momentous decision in the history of Spanish anarcho-syndicalism. It was to split the movement and open a rift between leadership and the militant masses. It meant the rejection of the whole tradition of the movement. Federica Moneste, one of the ministers, was the daughter of anarchists to whom the words government and authority signified negation of everything possible for freedom of man. The revolution we all wanted, but none of us expected, was threatened by the communists and their allies who wished to turn the militia, the safeguard of that revolution, into a disciplined army, dismantle the parallel government of revolutionary committees, and hot collectivization. For the CNT, joining the government was a defensive move, a last resort to save revolution, to prevent tricky and imposed radicalism. With power abetting away, the CNT must shed its principles so that we should not influence in the Spanish public life. The only alternative would have been to force its principles on Spain by a revolutionary dictatorship, but a dictatorship possible only in Catalonia in July would have not merely outraged libertarian principles, it would have failed and thus weakened the war effort against fascism, which would triumph and would destroy bourgeois democracy and the CNT alike. The CNT could not be in the streets and in the government. After a painful examination of her conscience, Friedrich Monty opted for the government with tears in her eyes. But the outset of the militants did not share this pessimistic collaboration, which in the end brought no rewards. When the Republican ministers fled from Madrid to Valencia, they narrowly escaped being shot en route by a CNT column. The new government proceeded in an attempt to stabilize the revolution. Militia committees were dissolved, collectivization was slowed down and regulated. Peasant privateers were assured by the Communist Minister of Agriculture, and police were cut off from the political parties. The process of turning militia into a regular army began, but Largo Caballero was not the man to dismantle the revolutionary conquest. As President Zana insisted, the dilemma of July persisted. The revolution had not been absorbed. It was not the only competing claims of parties and unions that weakened the central government. It is important to realize that the central government was never established throughout the whole Republican zone. This is a particular case in the Catalonia and the Basque provinces. Both had states of autonomy. The Basque provinces, Kristen Yescude, had been granted theirs in October 1936. Both sought to push autonomy to its limits. Companies declared that the Generals' Rebellion had turned Spain to a federal state and that the position of Catalonia as a separate state was an irresistible reality. More resolute nationalists argued that the Spanish state was a historical souvenir destroyed by its own collapse in July. To the politicians of Madrid, this was a selfish exploitation of the crisis of the democratic issue. Catalonia seized the assets of the Bank of Spain, issued its own banknotes, and robbed the central government of all its powers it could lay its hands on. Companies was accused of military inactivity and the failure to take a stand against the collectivization of CNT. In return for the implicit support of the anarcho-syndicalist Catalan independence, this tactic alliance existed after July 19th cannot be denied. Companies gave effective power to the anti-fascist militia committee, dominated by the CNT, perhaps in the home of domesticating blind destructive revolution of the CNT. When the central government recovered its control of Barcelona in May 1937, it destroyed both the CNT and Catalonian autonomy alike. What Azana called frivolous provincialism was not confined to Catalonia and Euskadi, where President Aguirre resisted all attempts by the central government to control the military operations until it was destroyed by the communist troops. The fief carved out in Aragon in the early days of the war by anarchist Thierry Durati was controlled by the CNT Council of the Aragon as an enclave of libertarian communism. To the historians of the CNT, it was a utopia of agrarian collectives, the margin of the revolution, where speculation usury vanished. To the communists, it was tyranny of brutal angerments. Austria had its own UG-CNT council, Stander, even with its own diplomatic representatives in London. There can be little doubt that competing power centers that emerged in summer of 1936 put great difficulties in the way of unified economy and the efficient war effect. Revolutionary clientelism in the economic spheres reflected in the municipality of local paper currency. Even more serious was the failure to achieve a united military command, a single general grift, the mondo unico of the communist slogan, immune and insulated from the pressures of political parties. This led General Rojo, who had to bear the military consequences of political fragmentation, to a verdict that must stand. In the political field, General Franco triumphed. In the spring of 1937, both the Nationalists and the Republicans experienced the most severe political crisis of the war. The resolution of these crises revealed that the relative ease with political divisions could be surmounted and a wartime concentration of power achieved in military authoritarian regime and its difficulties confronting such concentration in democracy. If the formal apparatus of democracy had been dismantled, a discipline of Ortega passed the war crossing out clauses of the Constitution of 1931, which had been abrogated de facto. The rivalry of parties survived the demise of true parliamentary life. In the Republic, the May crisis represented the final conflict between the defenders of spontaneous revolution and the apostles of ordered government and social conservatism. The predominant role of the communists is explained by their advocacy of a concentration of government, a regular army, and the organization of economy with one end in view: victory in the war. Either the government takes the necessary steps to win the war, Party Secretary Warren, or it ceases to be the government. The proprietary victim was Largo Caballero, who insisted to advance one of the communists in his own party and administration and in the army, where they thought to monopolize the corps of commissars. In what Largo called their reptilian intrigues, the communists found allies in Prieto and the left Republicans, who shared their own conviction that Largo Caballero was burnt out as a war leader and not the man to reverse the revolutionary conquest of July. The catalyst of the May crises, which gave Largo Caballero's enemies the chance to move in for the kill, was the troubles in Barcelona, which cost perhaps 500 lives and left an enduring legacy of political bitterness. In Barcelona, the revolutionary spontaneity of the previous summer, of the months of George Orwell, found the working class unsettled in a city with no tipping and no ties, had turned the sectarian bitterness and the ugly little rose between the Communist Party of Catalonia, the CNT, the POUM, and the PUSC, who chose to regard the POUM as Trotskyites. The PSUC was also attacking the revolutionary conquest militia. The entry of the CNT into government was not saving the movement from its enemies. The CNT militants who rejected the leader's collaboration entered into an informal common with the POUM. When the government police attacked the telephone exchange meant by the CNT, these discounts erupted into incohesive street fighting, the dust-up so brilliantly described by Orwell. The POUM leaders had been pressing on the CNT the necessity of a political takeover by the workers. The moment of truth had come. They had no alternative but to fling their lot with the CNT militants who had, according to the Secretary General, lapsed into the old mentality where everything could be solved by bombs and rifles. The POUM leaders were committed to a revolution which they knew was bound to fail. The CNT leaders in Valencia were appalled and sought to mediate. To Prieto, the May Days provided the chance to destroy the revolution in Barcelona and establish the control of central government in Catalonia. On the evening of May the 7th, assault cars entered Barcelona as a conquered city. The communists used Largo Caballero's reluctance to punish the POUM as fascist traitors as an excuse to get rid of the old man. The vengeance of the Communist Party, Ch.9, the besieged POUM leader, was murdered, and others arranged as traitors, remains a stain on the party's history. It was not that the communists' overall strategies were mistaken. Their strong plea for a strong government maintenance of a popular front that included bourgeois Republicans and the concentrations of the war effort was, in their own jargon, objectively correct. The policies of the POUM, the consequences of naive Marxist-Lenin dogmatism, had been a disaster, dissolving the Popular Front and cutting the Republic off from Soviet supplies in the vain hope of winning a war by a working-class revolution. It was communist methods which stank. The nighttime rap at the door by the secret police, the mysterious disappearance of once valued comrades, and the horrible atmosphere of suspicion and hatred. Orwell. The ruthless promotion of party members and the destruction of enemies and vilification. This was the last fate of Largo Caraballo and his rival Prieto, once the latter had been convinced that the communist policy of resistance was mistaken. Largo Caballero's successor as Prime Minister was psychologist Dr. Juan Negrin. A man of colossal energy and enormous appetites, he was presented in a post-war recommence of the exiled world as a communist dupe and a dictator. This he was not. He realized both the necessity to avoid offending the Soviet Union, which alone supplied the Republic with arms, and the need for a concentration of government advocated by the likes of the communists and the right-wing socialists of Prieto. Concentration he achieved, but at the price of excluding those forces, Largo Caballero's followers in the CNT, which claimed victory over the generals rising and creating endured political feuds. The concentration of power that the Republic struggled to achieve came naturally to the nationalists. Hierarchy and discipline were the dominant values of the anti-democratic movement. Prevailing style of military wears uniform insignia of reaction in Madrid. It was a passport to privilege, is in nationalist capitals of Burgos and Salamanca. Ordered government was a psychological necessity for the nationalists. From the outset, national Spain was a military state where power lay with the generals, the constant need for a single command. They elected Franco as commander-in-chief, and when he insisted on supreme political power granted to him on September 29, 1936, as head of the new government of the Spanish state, who assumed all the powers of the new state. The generals believed that they were creating a wartime dictatorship which, after victory, would restore the monarchy. In fact, they had created a Hobbesian sovereign endowed with greater powers than Napoleon, a sovereign who was to shed a few of those powers over 40 years and whose model was Philippe II, solitary, all-powerful bureaucrat of the Escorial. The achievement of political unity in the nationalist camp provides a sharp contrast to the Republican political feuding. To Franco, the determination of the Cartist leader Father Conde and the Falangist Hidelia to maintain the independence of the respective movements threatened the return to sterile party conflict of ignorant democracy. On April 18th, Franco announced from the balcony of his office in Salamanca the creation of a single movement that would unify all the political forces of national Spain. Unification was opposed from above. Franco declared on the radio that he embodied himself the national will to unity. The two main constitutes from which the new movement took its clumsy initials, FET de las JONS, were Cartelis and the Phalange. The Phalange had grown prodigiously since the Carter's creed lacked a certain modernity. Phalangism, faute de mieux, was only available ideological clothing if a military revolt barren of political ideas other than commitment to order was to attract the neutral mass. The new shirts who flocked to buy Phalangist uniforms had little sympathy with the social radicalism of Jose Antonio. Imprisoned in Alicante, where he was executed on November 20th, 1936, to become the absent one of the party ceremonial. The provisional leaders of the radical quasi-fascist wing, the Auditor Manuel Hidia, feared for the future of the movement in the military conservative atmosphere. Burgos and Samelica. I prefer repugnant Marxists to writers corrupted by politics and caquismo. In his struggle to keep the movement pure and independent, he was opposed by his rivals in the Phalangist clans. On April 16, 1937, the blackest day in the history of the Phalange, the ugly feuds erupted in gang warfare. The victory was neither Hidelia nor his rivals, but the Generalissimo. Rumors of a conspiracy of Hidia to prevent the virtual dissolution of the old Phalange to his arrest. He had refused the post of Secretary General of the new party. His fate was a warning to others that he had become the forgotten man of the right. Phalangists in the radical tradition might consider the decree of unification as sellout to clericalism, but their job secure as long as they keep their mouth shut, and most of them remain silent. The militant Carlists were the greater losers in the process of the unification from above. They had, in embittered Federgonde remark, lost a lot. The program of the new party was basically that of the Phalange, and there was no promise to restore the true dynasty. Franco now, as the chief of the party, as well as Generalissimo, had control of the state and controlled directly all important appointments in the government, the party, and the army. Apart from Franco, the victors were the Loyalists who had slipped into the administration and in the army. In the last resort rose Serrano Suner, Franco's brother-in-law and the architect of the unification, the center of gravity of the regime. Its true support was and continues to be the army. On January 30th, 1938, after ceremony fervent and devout like a night's vigil, Franco's ministry took its oath of allegiance. Its composition revealed that the simple secret of his statecraft, a cabinet appointed by himself, that the balanced forces of the regime, 3 generals, 1 Carlos, and 2 Phalanges, and 2 technocrats. 2 ministers came from the conservative monarchist Revolución Española, an indication of the essentially conservative nature of the regime, which had already turned its back on the Flemish national revolution. What Hitler called the clerical monarchical scum was floating to the top. In this conservative state of Phalangists, they were offered a consultation prize that was to give them a vast field of patronage and a continuing role in the labor movement. In the Phalangist ideal of a radically transformed, in which liberal laissez-faire capitalism would be replaced by the cooperation of capitalist and worker in vertical syndicates under the parental direction of the state without upsetting its respective situation of different classes, that provided the ideological basis of labor charter issued in March 1938. One of Franco's biographers had praised the charter as a law worthy of any British labor leader. On paper, yes. Few of the promises went into action in the war. Nationalist campaign Spain emphasized war austerity. There was one course meal campaign. While hours of work were reduced in Republican Spain, they were raised in National Spain. The vertical syndicates were to prove not altogether an effective instrument for the protection of labor in post-war Spain. Nevertheless, the autonomy of the labor movement had been completely destroyed. The vertical syndicate is an instrument at the service of the state through which it realizes its economic policy. It was an ordered hierarchy under the direction of the state. Security of employment was in these conditions. Minimal concession to labor denied the right to organize or strike for better conditions. Within this rigid national authoritarian framework. The war economy of the National Zone was tolerably organized, wages were fixed, and inflation was controlled. It was an economy based on confidence and victories. Banks in the National Zone gave loans on properties and territories still held by the Popular Front. Nor was the confidence confined to Spain. Foreign exchange rates held well above those of the Republic. In the outward appearance and political languages, Franco's new state seemed a recreation of the reign of the Catholic kings with the Italian fascist trimmings. The repellent rhetoric of the regime was diffuse, indeed incomprehensible to the rational mind, with its attempt by renovating tradition to reconcile 16th century with the modern authoritarian reaction against the inorganic democracy of parties. Silvano Sunter was admirer of Mussolini, yet he felt a mystic affinity with the Spain of Catholic kings. The return of the Jesuits and the reappearance of the crucifix in schools, half-holidays for the Aquinas, were symbols of this return to the past. The real conquest of the Church was its total recapture of the educational system. Republican teachers were purged, and those who remained subjected to intense retooling in courses with Catholic thought. Though it was the Phalange that was given control of the Students' Union, religious conformity was the test for students and professors alike. From Navarre, the focal point of mass religious commitment, created the band of fierce orthodoxy and Catholic Puritanism, was to mark the tone of life in national Spain. It was Navarre that first legislated against shirt sleeves in cafes and a modest dress. There were to be no advertisements for bathing dresses with women inside. Nationalist Puritanism even extended to assault on modernisms in the linguistic word "raigo," which on the menu was criticized as a decadent word. Newspaper articles must be written in language of Dux Gente. Libraries cleared of pornographic, Marxist, or corrupting works. Plastered over this propaganda, nationalist Spain thus had an old world flavor. The Generaliso's wartime headquarters was a reflection of the court of the monarchies. Refugees from the Republican zone arriving in national Spain were immensely relieved to find waiters ready to take orders. A few miles from the front, with hotels of Saragossa had hot baths, and there was restaurants with bright lights and animation. The Duke of Limera, fighter pilot who found Valladolid to repent with mountains of pretty girls. San Sebastian was muy amiado. He and his brother collected all the shoes outside the front doors of the room and took them to another floor, filled with soda water. Such going-ons were difficult to imagine in Barcelona or Madrid, for the furnishing of upper-class life had been either conscientiously destroyed, palaces converted to offices or barracks, or had fallen into decay with war shortages. Nothing appalled the nationalists more than this seemingly deliberate rundown of quote-unquote civilized life. The scent was awful, wrote Captain Bouillon, head of the censorship and tourism. On entering Barcelona, part of the accumulated feuds of the Reds beneath every town, the dust of the Ritz was inches thick. So was the dust on Spanish intellectual life. While to the liberals, modern Spain, recovered by her achievements in the realm of arts and sciences and international repute unknown since the 16th century, to the average nationalist, the true Spain of history portrayed by cosmopolitan professors. The rantings of one of these founding fathers of Phalangism, Jimenez Caballero, who had seen Mussolini as the savior of Catholicity and Cervantes as an anti-Spaniard betraying of the true values embodied in Don Juan and the bullfight, were characteristic not merely of an atmosphere that classed intellectuals as pessimists and rushed the unworthy of a place in virile Spain, but a relapse into verbal barbarism. The linguistic excesses of the Phalange and the ethical missionary state were to debase political and literary language for a generation. Their counterpart in Red Spain was the slogan-soaked world of Marxist propaganda. In spite of the Phalangist rhetoric, which infected the public pronunciation of government, the fundamental new state were militant order and Catholic orthodoxy. The values of Castile, the creator of Spanish unity, hammer of heretics, Catalan refugees after lapse into their spiritually intelligent native tongue, were enjoined to speak the language of the empire. This return to the identification of Spain with intrinsic Catholicism represented interpretation of Spanish history profoundly different from that of the best minds of the Republic. The two interpretations started with a common precept, what the Spanish historian Americo Castro has called the state of the progressive despair, that a disappointing performance of Spain, once the greatest imperial power in Europe in a modern, technical, and pragmatic world. The Republicans sought to raise Spain, for they were patriots too, by intimidating the progressive nations. From a vocal nationalist ideologist of 1936, only return to the universal empire and inward-looking values of Philip II could save Spain from the continuing ravages of decadent militarism. It was these institutions and their ideologies which had offered liberated Spain. This was a nationalist war of liberation. Republican Spain was slavery to regime, absolutely evil, and itself dependent on a foreign power, the Soviet Union. The purpose of the war was to end bondage, liberate Spain to be independent. The implication of this concept, central to Franco's whole thought, were never understood by his allies. Germans and Italians were always advocating Skerkedick or Blitzkrieg. They could not understand why Franco did not bomb and shell enemy cities out of existence. His slowness became an obsession with German staffers and drove Siano and Mussolini to fury. Are there no men in Spain? Give me aeroplanes, artillery, tanks, and ammunition, and give me diplomatic support, and I shall be grateful. Franco told the Italian ambassador in April 1937, above all, don't make me hurry. Do not force me to win at top speed, for all this would mean killing more Spaniards, destroying a great part of the wealth of the country. Strategically, this committed Franco to a war of attrition, of desiccate or wearing out. Liberated, Spain must be great, and to be made great, she must be independent. And Franco quickly saw that most immediate threat to the independence of his new state lay on the economic demands and political pressures of his allies, Germany and Italy. Yet he desperately needed arms. To balance his necessities and his allies' impunities against the defense of his own freedom of action was difficult exercise and brinkmanship. By 1939, Franco had proved himself the most successfully obstinate statesman ever produced by a secondary power. The contest with Germany concerned of the mineral resources of Spain. Germany, Hitler admitted, needs iron ore. That is why we want a nationalist government to buy Spanish ore. Franco was determined to keep his economic options open against German pressures to corner all of Spain's minerals for the Reich, an operation called the Montagne scheme. The demand fellow complained that German ambassador habitually does exactly the opposite of what we suggest just to demonstrate his independence. Every demand of Germans was fought every inch of the way, but Franco's need for German military aid was so compelling that national Spain was on its way to becoming an economic colony of the Reich. The nationalist government had to allow huge parts of debt to Germany to be paid off by the purchase of Spanish mines. The Montagne scheme at last home and dry. Military organization reflected political structure. The nationalists created a conventional regular army and the core of the North African Army. The Republicans never fully overcame the defeats of voluntarism of the militia system. The Popular Army of the Republic was a remarkable creation given its unpromising point de départ. There were able commanders and planners, some with little military experience, like the communist Lister or Ciprian Mera of the CMT, some regular officers like General Rojo, the strategical brain of the Republican command. But the middle echelons were weak. The Nationalists started with a superior number of loyal junior officers. They trained the provincial lieutenants, later to become the staunchest supporters of Franco's rule. Its notable achievements notwithstanding, the Popular Front as a military machine that could be deployed by a unified command was inferior to the Nationalist army. These factors explain the main feature of war. The Republicans could plan a series of surprise attacks that broke through the long front, but ambitious offensives bogged down after a few kilometers and turned into a dodged defense of small gains. Franco, unimaginative as a strategist, was a methodical battle commander. His dictum was that no attack should be mounted unless its momentum could be maintained. To follow through was all important, particularly the incapacity to follow through what was a bidding weakness of the popular front. Neither side got all the modern equipment it needed, and both often fought with job lots of outdated and overworn weapons. It was a pauper's war in which the only tactical innovation was dive bombing. The supply of arms from the Soviet Union to the Republicans and from Germany and Italy to the Nationalists changed the balance of war. Thus, in 1936, the Republic was well supplied and had command of the air. By the end of the war, the Nationalist armies were better equipped, and supplies to the Republic erratic and irregular. By the last of the battles, as Sana put it, you could break our front with bicycles. In the early months of the war, as we've seen, the critical factor was Franco's African army, ferried by ships and airlift, the only strategical novelty of the war from Morocco to Andalusia. Trained troops, they advanced on Madrid through Extremadura, cutting the militia like knife through butter. With Molla's columns held in the mountains to the northeast of Madrid, Franco's small, battle-weary army was held in the western suburbs by Rojo's newly advanced army, to be strengthened morally and materially by the first fights of the international brigades. Madrid was Franco's obsession. And a successful defense was the decisive victory that determined the whole course of the war. Had Madrid fallen in November, Republican opposition would have collapsed in the winter of 1936. Franco's efforts to break through and surround the capital on the south were thwarted in the bloody Battle of Jarama on February 1927, in which the best units of the International Brigade suffered heavy casualties. A month later, Italian drive from the north, a badly planned militarized offensive along a single road of appalling winter conditions, was held in the Battle of Guadalajara. Defense of Madrid was more improved in a war the defense of the popular army. It was turned by propaganda of the left into an epic victory of Spanish democracy or fascism, triumph in Europe. Madrid, the tomb of fascism, ran slogan, the Madrid, the universal frontier, was liberty and slavery. It is fighting for humanity. The mantle of blood shelters of all health human beings. For the good response to the New York Times, Guadalajara changed the stream of world history. This euphoria concealed a failure to retake Oviedo in defense of that of Toledo were the epics that corresponded to Madrid and nationalist propaganda, and the total failure of malformed militia system to prevent the fall of Malaga to the Italians. By the spring of 1937, Franco's military advisors had persuaded him to abandon his costly obsession with Madrid and to concrete his available forces on the conquest of the north. Once more, northern campaign exposed the military consequences of political fragmentation. There was no unified command. Aghieri, president of Euskadi, wanted planes and tanks from Madrid. Not an interfering general. Request, Your Excellency. The general appointed by Madrid cabled the Minister of War whether the army I'd honored to be appointed to the command exists or not. On Monday, April 26, came the most notorious event of the whole war. Complete destruction, high explosive incendiary bombs in the small vast town of Gunanesia. The bombardment was the work of the Condor Legion, the German squadron serving with the national forces. Regarded by the German command as a legitimate operation of the war, destruction of Guernica was presented in Europe as an act of unparalleled barbarism. Fascists were not only barbarians but liars. The nationalist press agencies maintained that the town had been burnt by red incendiaries, a palpable lie that was a gift to Republican propagandists. Dramatized in Picasso's Guernica terror was exploited as a warning to Europe the horrors of war against fascism. It became a symbolic event with the Renaissance of all proportion to its military significance, resurrected in the 1970s to condemn U.S. bombings in Vietnam. So important are the myths of the propaganda in war, especially in civil wars, nationalists maintained their version that all evidence in order to fleeing the charge of barbarism back against their enemies. Bilbao, blockaded and starved, fell on June 19th. The Catholic Basques, fighting to defend their autonomy rather than a lay republic, lost heart. Stunstander was captured, and by a model maneuver on August 26th in Ostadius, the socialist stronghold, initially tough resistance, suddenly collapsed like merengue dipped in water. The northern victories were decisive. The iron ore and the industry of the north were in nationals' hands. The retreating Basques had refused to the blown-up foundations, the economic strengths of their patria. The iron foundries and metalworks around Bilbao. Franco now controlled 62% of Spanish territory and over half the population. 25% of the Republican forces had vanished in defeat. The offensives mounted by the Republic to relieve the pressure on the north revealed the strength and weakness of the Popular Army. Ambitious conceptions of General Rojo, they had collapsed into muddles on the ground, turning into costly defensive battles. The mastery of the air had passed into the Nationalists, but until they saw the first appearance of Masha in mid-109. Negrin inherited a disastrous military situation. The Republican offense against Teruel on December 15, 1937, fell in terrible winter conditions, failed. Franco has turned his forces through Aragon to cut the Republic into two by reaching the Mediterranean. The Aragon battle saw some of the worst collapse of morale and the most vicious political, military infighting of the war. It was Negrin's credit that he pulled together the Republic to fight its greatest battle. When Franco turned from Aragon to Valencia, a mistaken decision that committed his armies to a difficult campaign, the Republican army crossed the Ebro to fall on his rear. It was a classic story of defense until November of a small territorial game, the first days of July. Franco used the battle to destroy the Republican army. When he attacked in Catalonia, resistance disintegrated. On the first day of collapse, the whole front, it was Route Rojo, one of the many which had been to lot by witness. It was astonishing propaganda achievement to maintain Republican enthusiasm in the face of process of continual defeat, usurped by occasional triumphs. But by 1938, internal feuds and mutual recrimination routed morale. Shortage of food and consumer goods turned the Republican zone into a barter economy and life into grim, gray shelter for existence. As final defeat drew close, the necessity of making one's family's acceptable to victors, their supporters waited in shadows in every town to take power or triumph. Loyalty withered, sacrificed to survival, confronted with massive desertions. The attempts to enforce loyalty by the government and security forces dominated by the communists resembled a generalized tyranny. The tragic irony of the Civil War is that it ended as it begun, with a pronunciamiento against the government. The section of the army that had ceased to represent the national will. Colonel Casado resented the growing power of the communists in the army and believed that Negrin's policy resistance after the collapse of Catalonia was suicidal. Supported by the old enemies of the communists, the CNT and the moderate socialist leader, Vesitario, he formed a national council denouncing Negrin's government as a petrifying corpse dominated by the communists. The communist units in Madrid revolted and were suppressed by Casado's troops. Both were wearing the same Republican uniform. Perhaps 250 lives were sacrificed in a pointless eruption of irrelevant feuds. Casado hoped that Franco would recognize a fellow soldier in his anti-communist crusade and grant terms that would protect respectable Republicans. Franco insisted on the unconditional surrender of an absolute evil. With the naval base of Cartagena in chaos, the Republican troops deserting en masse, the Caudillo knew there was nothing to fight, and on the evening of March 31st, down with influenza, General Franco was informed that his troops had occupied their objectives and the Civil War had ended. Both sides, for propagandist purposes to win foreign support, presented the war as a battle of ideologies that divided Europe. The generals themselves presented themselves as crusaders, defending European civilization against the communist plot rather than defenders of Spanish conservative interests. For the left, the war was the wire struggle of democracy against fascism. What was its origins, a domestic tragedy that thus became the great divide of politics and the intellectual discourse of Europe and Latin America. The wrangles of the Non-Intervention Committee, sitting in London, not merely covered the reluctance of Western democracy aid to the Republic, they exposed and crystallized the alignments of the great powers that gave the fascist powers a sense of weakness, and degenerate democracies where Spain embittered domestic politics and divided political parties. In England and France, it not merely heightened the conflicts between left and right, both left and right emerged in 1939, riven by their attitudes to the war. The war left a mark on a whole generation of intellectuals. Almost every European writer of significance supported the Republic. In America, Hemingway wrote his longest novel of the war, James Baldwin, his first short story. The Communist Party orchestrated writers' protests and the international brigades, their hardcore compulsive party militants ruthlessly purged cosmopolitan agencies of the American intelligence network. The defeat of the Republic was exposed of the role of the Communist Party, and for instance, its attack on Andre Gide at the Writers' Conference of 1937 and its campaign against POM revealed by George Orwell produced a sense of disenchantment. After Spain, there was little theft of the 30s movements, but a feeling of resignation and a sense of guilt. Liberals and socialists felt they had been taken in using communist propaganda campaigns of screaming lies and hatred. The war raised its most acute problem of the political commitment of intellectuals and sacrificed artistic integrity commitment details. There was no place for tender consciousness in what the English poet Cecil D. Lewis described as the battle between light and darkness. The effects of the political polarization on Spain were unfortunate. The literary outpost of the nationalists was pulsing, typical of early outposts of Jose Maria Penman's poem of the Beast and the Angel in 1939 with its crude anti-Semitic outbursts. On the Republican side, a set of fine poet like Rafael Alberti became a communist and abandoned poetry for political rhetoric. The only major party writer who could turn the ode to the Krakow trajectory into poetry was Miguel Hernandez. The strains of war produced a distrust of the imagination which had persisted in a generation of poets laboring under and against Franco. Okay, thank you.